I remember the sound of the depot burning, not as a roar but as a language that wanted to swallow us whole. And I remember Asher's cry cutting through it like a name you never want to lose. I pulled him from the smoke with hands that barely felt like mine, the heat blistering my skin, my body shuddering from exhaustion, and yet somewhere beneath that weight I carried something heavier still. The lantern that once belonged to Gideon Harlow, our father, the only inheritance we had left, the only symbol of light in a night determined to erase us. The flames clawed at the walls behind us, beams snapping like bones, sparks rising like stars too far to reach. And in that moment I felt what it truly meant to be vulnerable, what it meant to stand in the crossroad of survival and grief with no map but a flicker of fire trapped inside glass. We stumbled into the snow outside, our feet bare, the air colder than any wound, the contrast so brutal it felt like the world was punishing us for daring to survive. Asher clung to me, coughing, eyes wide with terror, his thin frame trembling as though the fire had taken not just warmth but trust, and I looked at him the way an older brother looks, when he knows he cannot fail because failure means abandonment. Written into history, the same abandonment that had marked our foster care corridors where boys like us were trained to fold themselves into silence before they learned to speak. The depot collapsed behind us, wood groaning, glass shattering, a lifetime reduced to embers, and yet, in my hands, I felt the weight of that lantern pressing against my ribs like memory refusing to let go. It was more than an object. It was recognition, resilience, and a reminder of every second chance Gideon had whispered about in moments I never fully understood until they were gone. The lantern glowed faintly, its flame flickering inside cracked glass, and in that glow I saw reflections of places I thought I had buried, diners at midnight, where strangers looked at their coffee instead of each other, streetlights that turned sidewalks into confessionals, mirrors in penthouse bathrooms where I could not face the man I was becoming, the letters of truth I burned instead of opening because forgiveness written in ink terrified me more than silence. It was all there, folded into the trembling light, a reminder that survival was not the same as living, that resilience without intimacy is only exile by another name. Asher pressed his face against my chest and whispered, "Don't let it go, Silas." And I nodded, though my hands already ached, because I understood in that moment that I was not holding an object but a scar shaped into bronze, a wound disguised as heritage, a fragile second chance waiting to either redeem or condemn us. The snow spread before us like a mirror with no reflection, a blank stage where the world dared us to keep walking, and I thought of every cracked sidewalk that had ever carried me when no one else would, every luxury car window that had returned my face like a stranger, every clinic of second chances I had walked past because trust is easier to flee than to earn. The depot behind us smoldered, smoke twisting upward like a letter addressed to heaven with no reply, and in that rising I felt the gravity of recognition that sometimes the fire does not just destroy wood and glass. It destroys the silence we once called safety, and it leaves us with only what cannot be replaced, a bond, bruised but unbroken, fragile but alive. Asher's small hand gripped mine, his voice trembling with a fear he tried to hide, and in his eyes I saw the same loneliness I had carried for years, the loneliness that hides behind resilience, the loneliness that makes a child mistake distance for safety. He whispered again, softer this time, "Will he know we kept it?" And though I wanted to say yes, though I wanted to promise that Gideon's ghost would see us here, alive, bruised, and still guarding his flame, all I could do was hold the lantern higher, letting its glow paint us in light that felt too fragile to belong to us. For a moment the glass reflected my face, distorted and broken, and I thought of the mirror in that diner bathroom, The one I avoided because it showed me a man who ran instead of stayed, a man who chose silence instead of intimacy, a man who mistook emotional distance for strength. We stood there until the cold pressed its first verdict, whispering through our bones, urging us to lay down beside the ashes and let the night keep us. Vulnerability weighed heavier than frost, and I understood then why people choose to vanish instead of endure, why some wounds become identities, why silence masquerades as resilience when it is only exile in disguise. But I could not let Asher go, not when his breath rattled like the last chance I still had to make good on all the trust I had broken. The lantern's light trembled, fighting against the wind, and I whispered to it the words I had never spoken aloud, words meant for forgiveness I had always feared. Not tonight, not while he still believes in me. The depot was gone, Gideon was gone, and yet something remained, fragile as a flicker, fierce as a vow. We were only two children in the snow, barefoot, scarred, half-broken, but the lantern burned like a second chance, daring us to believe that trust could be earned again, that healing could begin even here, in ruins, that recognition and forgiveness might still find us if we kept walking. And yet as the night deepened, as the silence grew heavier, as Asher's head fell against my shoulder and my own legs trembled, I knew that light alone would not be enough, because in the corner of the ruin, beyond the reach of flame, I saw a shadow move, and for the first time since the fire began, I realized we were not alone. The flames had ended, the depot was ashes, but someone else was waiting in the dark, watching us guard a lantern that might not be ours to keep. We guarded a light in a place built for ghosts. The depot did not fall silent when the flames collapsed into themselves. It breathed in a new language, a low, an aching grammar of settling timber and cooling iron, a nocturne of ash that lifted in slow spirals like the last thoughts of a place that had finally understood it was gone. And in the middle of that fading life, I crouched with Asher in the cinders, our knees pressed to charcoal and splinters, both of us shaking in that way the body shakes when it has run out of orders to give but refuses to surrender. My fingers welded by cold to the copper handle of our father's lantern, as if the metal were the hinge between breath and forgetting, and I had been put in charge of keeping it from rusting shut. The lantern was never simply an object to be catalogued, never just glass and a wick and a little cup of fuel that trembled when the wind tested the seams. It was Gideon Harlow's last workable sentence, the clause he left behind for nights like this when the world tried to erase the punctuation that holds a family together. And even here, where smoke turned every lungful into a negotiation, and the snow lay in drifts that looked like shrouds, tossed casually over what the fire did not have time to finish, that flame worked like a pulse, thin and deliberate, a faint sound you press your ear against a wall to hear, convincing me that if I kept the light alive, I might also keep the part of him that knew how to come home. I turned the lantern toward me and found the familiar injuries heat-bubbled glass on the south side where it had lived too close to the depot's stove for too many winters, a hairline fracture that ran like a river from rim to base, soot fingerprints layered like rings in an old tree, and beneath the grime, the initials that were every bit as much prayer as Mark, G.H., made with a pocket knife and a stubbornness that did not shout but also did not change its mind. And when Asher traced those letters with the pad of his smallest finger, whispering them like a spell, I felt that old ache return, the one that binds vulnerability to love, trust to risk, forgiveness to time, resilience to the ordinary chore of staying. Snow fell through the broken roof in a drifting quiet that made the world sound padded and far away, each flake catching the orange of the wick and glowing for a heartbeat before giving itself to the dark. And I thought, not for the first time tonight, How many places a boy can learn loneliness before it becomes his native tongue under the humming bulbs of a diner at 2 in the morning where a waitress refills your cup without asking for your story. Beneath streetlights that make wet pavement look like a river you are supposed to cross without ever getting your feet wet. In the back seat of luxury cars that smell of leather and anonymity, where windows return your face like an alibi and not a fact. In penthouse bathrooms where mirror glass is expensive enough to make the truth look like an upgrade. In the waiting rooms of clinics of second chance, where names are called softly, and I never stood when mine was spoken, because I had practiced the liturgy of emotional distance too perfectly to interrupt it with a yes. The wind pressed its palm against the black ribs of the depot, and the whole frame answered with a tired animal's groan. Asher flinched and pushed closer, his cheek gritty with ash against my sleeve, his breath a hot tremble on the crook of my elbow, and I realized how small his hand felt in mine, now that the heat had gone, how quickly the nervous system confuses numbness for safety, how the mind trained by abandonment and missed connections and letters of truth left unopened because the truth is a blade that insists on touching what it names will decide that any quiet is a kindness if the alternative is being known. "Don't let it die," he said, not loud and not demanding, just the tone of someone who has taken inventory and found only one item he cannot bear to lose. And I told him I wouldn't, though the promise clicked against my teeth like a match that refuses to strike. And in the same breath I told myself again the private creed that keeps boys like me moving when movement looks unwise. If the light goes out, we die twice, once for the cold and once for the history, once for our bodies and once for Gideon's voice, which I could still hear in the mechanical comfort of the lantern's hiss. The sound, he said, taught him patience when storms parked themselves on the tracks, and men cursed rails that were not designed for weather or grief. We made a bed of ruined burlap and brittle paper, a pilgrim's pallet of invoices and timetables curled into delicate fossils by heat, and I pulled Asher into the smallest cave my arms could construct, the lantern set between our ribs like a third heart. And with that triangle arranged, I tried to speak to him about nothing in particular, the way Gideon taught me to find the warmest seam in a boarded room, the trick of turning a coat so the wet side learns to dry while the air touches it, the difference between a storm that is still hungry and a storm that is only licking the bowl, the kind of practical healing that chooses plain verbs over legends because healing is almost always a quiet transformation. And I could feel the old injury of our distance trying to rehearse its favorite speech, the one that makes intimacy sound like danger and presence feel like a debt that accrues interest overnight. But Asher's eyes were already climbing and falling like a kite in tired wind, and the lantern's wick made that small, stubborn flame that took off the edge of fear without pretending to cure it. And in the strange hush that arrives after adrenaline has swallowed itself, I kept seeing reflections that were not mine, not only the familiar catalog of mirrors I had dodged in diner bathrooms, or the skittering double of myself in a black car door as it moved me past other people's addresses, not the penthouse vanity that filled the room with me and still made me feel absent, but a particular oval of cheek and brow and an angle of mouth that did not belong to either of us, hovering for a beat against the lantern's glass, as if the light itself remembered a face and meant to rehearse it until I learned how to say the name. "Did you see that?" I asked the dark, and the dark excused itself as it always does when confronted with questions it did not arrive to answer. And so I pretended the flicker was a trick of sleep and the refraction of a cracked pane and the sort of wishful thinking people learn when they have had to assemble families from strangers and stay alive without the warranty of belonging. And yet I kept leaning closer, mouth ajar as if breath mine, Gideon's. The nights might leave a translation there I could finally read. The ache in my legs announced itself once the fire's drama had been replaced by the administrative work of survival, and my feet began to trouble me in that different register, the one that describes wounds not as stories but as facts. Raw skin and open splits packed with soot that would need water I did not have, and hunger did the arithmetic of itself behind my ribs, while thirst tried to decide whether to be a throat problem or a philosophy problem, and still I remained appointed to the simple priesthood of a wick that requires tending, trimming ash with a thumbnail warmed over the chimney, breathing the softest breath I had to offer so the flame would lean toward it and stay, whispering to Asher the nonsense hymns brother mouths invent when they are trying to teach the body to stay in place. Stay, stay. You can sleep. I'll watch. I won't let it die. I know we're alone, but not alone like before. Not the urban loneliness with its cracked sidewalks and its streetlight sermons and its faceless attractions that teach you to perform yourself against windows until the life behind them moves on without you. Not the foster care quiet that requires boys to shrink themselves until the room forgets their size. Not the penthouse emptiness masquerading as privacy. This is a different quiet. A quiet where the only witness is fire and fire is enough. The lantern clicked and flared and resumed its ordinary labor, and for a time I got to feel like someone competent, a man who could be trusted with a small, crucial chore. And in that feeling was a beginning I did not pressure by naming, because naming turns beginnings into duties, and I had plenty of those already. And as the ash melted into a damp crust that dirtied my knees, and the sky learned the softer black that means the moon is trying to remember us, I decided that if Gideon had left us anything besides the lantern, it was this practice: to keep showing up for the small lights, even when the large ones burn the building down, and to cultivate presence that does not need to be narrated, to let love defy the tropes that dress it in fireworks, and instead choose the steadiness that makes breakfast possible. Asher dreamed loudly, little whimpers punctuating breath, and twice I put a palm to his chest, the way Gideon used to check me when the croup stole my air. Twice I felt the thin drum of resilience, and told myself the story that turns panic into patience. He is here. You are here. The light is here. And although the world has practiced abandonment long enough to be good at it, you do not have to collaborate tonight. And perhaps because I believed myself for the space of 10 breaths, or perhaps because belief is not required for certain mercies, the lantern's flame stood up taller on its wire spine, and the depot made less noise, as if deciding that the dead could rest without our permission. And then, because the heart is an animal that refuses scheduled quiet, I leaned in again, compelled by something unreasoning, and the glass became once more a mirror, and in that thin, bronze-lit oval I saw not my own wrecked face, and not Asher's, but a gaze I could not name with certainty, steady and near, as if the light had drawn a witness out of the dark, as if recognition were not a luxury but a law, and the sight of it untied something low in my gut that had been cinched for years, and I understood that whatever came next would not be decided only by weather. Once, I swore I saw someone's face in the lantern glass, but it wasn't mine. The cold made its first offer. Lie down and join the ashes mourning. Does not apologize for arriving in ruins. It inventories them, and the inventory it took of us was unflattering. A structure missing its roof, a pair of boys missing their sleep, a lantern missing half its fuel, a history missing the man who had written it so far, and the cold, which has always preferred paperwork to poetry, filed a motion at once, requesting our surrender on the grounds of inevitability. And when the judge asked if we had anything to say, we coughed and tried to stand, and found that neither of us was fluent enough in warmth to compose a convincing argument. The depot, at dawn, looked like the skeleton of an animal bigger than we deserved to have known. Ribs of charred timber arcing against a sky that had taken on the particular gray you get when snow means to continue until it has concluded its thesis. and the smell wet ash and cooled iron, and the fatigue of baked earth already belonged to memory, which is to say it wanted to stand a little to the left of the present and comment, and I would have been equal to the commentary if my feet had not decided to become a different category of problem, swelling into a dumb ache that made every step both simpler and more expensive. The skin across the balls split and peppered with cinder. Heel blisters opened by panic into mouths that would complain all day. Toes gone to that alarming blank where sensation used to live, and now a slow fire moves in without heat. Asher watched me the way small brothers watch older ones, when the script says the older boy is going to make a decision he cannot pay for later. And I tried to make the next sentence sound like competence rather than confession, tried to stretch the word we into a tent we could both stand under. We should move. We should find shelter beyond the depot's shadow because grief has a way of enlarging the cold. We should keep the lantern high where the wind can't bite it, and I'll take the weight of it because you are still learning the weight of you. And he nodded with that thin solemnity children use when they have eaten their allowance of fear for the day and set their plates aside. We rose, and the ash announced our rising, breaking under our knees with a brittle hush. And I learned in the first 4 paces that the snow had become a different animal than last night, less theatrical, more administrative, the kind of cold that does not bother to bluff, because it knows what time can do to a boy's promise. And as we skirted the black outline of what used to be the freight office, I caught our reflection in a window that hadn't finished giving. Up. A sheet of bubbled glass slumped in its frame like a man asleep where he should have died standing. And in that distorted mirror I saw the pair we were. A taller shadow with shoulders trying to impersonate a door. A smaller one leaning into that pretense. And between them, an orange insisting on being seen. There are many kinds of loneliness, and the winter, generous as always, offered me the full sampler. There was the urban loneliness that comes with cracked sidewalks and flickering neon, where the diner's window fogs with other people's breath, and you practice the choreography of missed connections until it earns you a certificate. There was the luxury loneliness that rides you between addresses in cars that do not belong to you, wrapped in upholstery that has never had to forgive anything. There was the penthouse. Loneliness that turns mirror glass into a choir of strangers who look well-fed and are not. There was the clinic. Loneliness where your name is called and you do not stand. And then there was this new species, the rural arithmetic of distance where every step asks for a receipt and the wind stamps it and does not look you in the eye. We did not have food, and we did not have sense enough to go find it. Not right away. Because when a life bends itself overnight, the mind needs a day to go through its files and discover that the folder labeled future has been emptied by a thief who left your footprints on the floor as paperwork. And so we walked a little to find a wall that still knew the wind and sat against it. And I set the lantern on my knee and taught my hands the small ceremony of keeping it from quitting. A pinch of the wick here, the softest breath there. A thumb to the chimney to wake the glass without cracking it. And because you can't do one ritual without inviting the others, I heard myself talk to Asher about Gideon, about the way he could tell the difference between a storm that meant to pass and a storm that meant to teach, about how he used to say that trust is not a door you kick down but a hinge you oil every day until it forgets how to squeak. About forgiveness as something you practice in private so you don't have to perform it in public, and somewhere between my mouth and his ear the story turned into the heat it needed to be. But the cold is thorough, and it does not believe in narrative arc. It believes in duration. It believes in the way fingers make fists when they are trying not to forget they belong to a wrist. It believes in the economy of breath where exhale becomes a taxable event. And when Asher's teeth began to clatter in an unmusical time signature, I took his face between my palms and made my voice behave like a room with a door. You're here. I'm here. We are still the same two boys. We were inside a house that had a roof and a father who knew how to return. This is not the end. This is the middle of the part that will make sense later. Keep your eyes on the light. It is small but not nothing, and there is a kind of resilience that does not demand applause, only attendance. If it goes out, he said, almost conversationally, do we go out too? And there was no sentence I could make that would be both honest and gentle. So I told the truth in a way that did not bruise. If it goes out, we make another. But it is better if this one stays, because it knows our names and we know its sound. And he nodded and pressed his forehead to the lantern's warm shoulder. And in that pose I recognized a form of prayer that does not ask for anything except a reason to stay exactly where you are. We made a plan because plans are blankets, thin but better than air. We would move along the lee side of what remained. We would test each step as if the ground were an opinion that might change its mind. We would keep the lantern high and the conversation higher. We would tell each other the truth without weaponizing it. We would guard the space between us as if it were a stove. And above all, we would refuse the offer the cold had placed so politely at our feet. The one that sounded like rest and meant forever. And as if to reward us for our professionalism, the wind abated for the length of 3 slow breaths, and we took them like medicine, long and careful, and shared. I do not know when the hunger took a seat at our table and announced itself as a permanent guest, but I remember the exact second thirst stopped pretending to be a suggestion and declared itself law, the tongue sticking to the words I wanted, the throat converting every idea to sand. And through that desert a memory moved me in a clinic, painted the dun color administrators believe will make people reasonable, my name arriving like a small bird on a nurse's mouth, my knees deciding for me that standing was a trick I did not know, the letter of truth in my coat pocket going unread because truth is a weather that requires the right coat, and I had dressed for another season entirely. I thought about that version of me now and told him, across time, that I had finally learned a vocabulary for staying, even if I had to borrow nouns from pain to conjugate it. The lantern guttered, a single, frightening bow toward the inevitable, and I cupped it with both hands until the glass warmed enough to be itself again, and Asher made the small sound children make when a toy breaks in a way they cannot understand. And I said, quickly, no, not breaking, just resting, like us. And I lifted the light and tickled the wick, and the flame complied. And the look he gave me added a year to my life I had not expected to keep. And then because stories do not exist to comfort us so much as to carry us across the hour they came, sounds that did not belong to weather. It started as a rumor on the edge of hearing, a syllable the wind could not pronounce properly, a crunch that might have been the settling of a drift or a plank. An ice god had decided to fold, but then the rhythm declared itself, steady and spaced, the kind of footfall a person makes when the land beneath him is not a metaphor but a series of obligations, and my heart, which had been staging its own wild protest against cold and memory, found a different meter, a readiness I recognized from doorways and stairwells and lobbies of buildings where I had waited for people I did not deserve to meet. I turned the lantern so that its little sun would face whatever intended us, and the light laid a ribbon across the wreckage and discovered nothing that loved it back. But the steps continued, deliberate as a sentence you know will change the page, and Asher's fingers, which had been content to be 10, became claws inside my sleeve, and every old rule I knew about trust and distance, and the way survival arcs away from intimacy at the last moment assembled in my mouth, ready to argue that we should hide, that we should make ourselves faceless, that no unplanned encounter has ever saved anyone's life for free. But the steps were not asking me what I believed. They were announcing a presence, and presence has always been stronger than my theories. And so I stood, knees arguing, and raised the lantern higher, and the light threw a trembling geometry against the snow, and the wind obliged us by lowering its voice so the world could hear what came next. The wind carried a sound I couldn't explain, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. I heard Gideon Harlow in the wind, and I answered anyway. The voices in the ash didn't belong to the living, but I still found myself speaking back. That was the first trick the storm played on me. It knew the sound of my father's voice better than I did. It bent the howl of wind through the depot's broken ribs and turned it into something that carried his weight, his cadence, the low patience with which Gideon Harlow once told me that silence was a language if you listened close enough. I should have dismissed it as imagination, as the paranoia that rises after too much hunger and too little rest. But hunger doesn't shape syllables, and exhaustion doesn't call you by your name. Asher, I whispered, shaking his shoulder. Did you hear that? He blinked through the snow, his lashes clumped with frost, and his lips trembled into something that looked too much like hope. It's him, he said. He's still here. He's guiding us. I wanted to tell him no, that it was the wind playing with what little strength we had left, but I couldn't force the words, because deep inside, past the cynicism carved into me by foster hallways where boys learned to shrink, past the urban nights where I sat in diners and refused to meet anyone's eyes, past the letters of truth I burned because they terrified me more than lies. There was a part of me that wanted to believe it, a part that wanted to believe Gideon had left us more than a lantern, more than initials scratched in copper, more than the memory of silence too thick to penetrate. The depot creaked around us, its shadows alive. Ash swirled into shapes, stretching into figures too steady to be tricks. My chest ached as if memory itself had a heartbeat, and every flicker of light in the lantern showed me ghosts of faces I had lost. My reflection bent in the soot-stained glass until it was no longer me but someone I used to be, a boy who thought survival was the same as worth. I blinked and saw strangers in the drift, silhouettes leaning against broken beams, mouths moving though no sound escaped. Paranoia, hallucination, or recognition, I didn't know, but I tightened my grip on the lantern because it was the only proof I had left that something of Gideon's voice was still burning. Asher curled against me, whispering again, "He's here, Silas. Don't you feel it? He wouldn't leave us alone." I wanted to tell him he was wrong. I wanted to tell him that men leave, that fathers leave, that abandonment is more certain than forgiveness, that I had built my entire life around the idea that trust is a fire you guard until it burns you. But when I opened my mouth, another truth came out instead. Then we keep his flame alive, no matter what. I don't know if it was for Asher or for me, but I said it like a vow. Vulnerability, disguised as promise. Loneliness, disguised as resilience. And for one strange moment, it felt like Gideon answered, the storm softening just enough for the lantern's glow to stretch further into the ruins. But then, as I stared into the broken walls of the depot, I saw something different. Not a face in glass, not a shadow formed by ash. Something more deliberate. A figure standing at the edge of the wreckage. Tall, steady, real. And then I saw her shadow in the wreckage. Tall, steady, and real. Out of smoke, a Choctaw widow who looked like judgment. She walked out of the ruins like someone who had already buried everything once. That was the first thing I thought when I saw her. She didn't move like a stranger. She moved like survival itself, wearing grief the way other people wear coats. The fire had taken so much from us, but from her it had taken nothing she had not already offered once before. Her shawl was pulled tight across her shoulders, dark wool lined with frost, the edges ragged as if they had carried more winters than I could count. Her hair was braided, beads threaded into the strands, each one clinking like the punctuation of a story told without needing to be spoken. And her eyes, they didn't plead, they didn't accuse, they didn't comfort. They watched, unreadable, a mirror I could not avoid. Asher pressed against me, clutching the lantern as if she might take it from us. His voice cracked. "Silas, who is she?" I had no answer. I only knew that her presence felt heavier than the snow pressing on the depot roof, heavier than the silence between us. She stopped just far enough that the lantern's glow kissed her boots but not her face, and when she finally spoke, her words cut sharper than the cold. Why guard fire in a place already burned? I felt the question pierce deeper than she intended, because it wasn't about the lantern. Not really. It was about me, about every diner where I sat at 2 a.m., pretending I didn't care if no one spoke to me, about every sidewalk cracked beneath the weight of footsteps that never slowed for me, about the luxury cars where I wore masks to fit into lives that were not mine, about the penthouse reflections where mirrors accused me of being half a ghost, about every clinic I walked past when second chances were waiting inside. Why guard fire? Why guard anything when my history proved I couldn't keep it alive? Asher's grip on my sleeve tightened. He was shaking, but his eyes stayed locked on her. He didn't see judgment. He saw something closer to recognition, as if Gideon's voice had led us here for a reason. "Because it's his," Asher whispered, voice trembling but certain. "Because it's all we have left." Her eyes flicked to him, and for the briefest second, her face softened, not into pity, but into something stranger, understanding. She had carried this question before. She had held flames in ruins too. She had lived in the long shadow of abandonment and learned the vocabulary of resilience without applause. Still, she didn't move closer. She stood there, framed by smoke and ruin, her silence as deliberate as the storm. She didn't walk away either. She just waited, watching us, like she was measuring not the flame in the lantern, but the one in us. And in that silence, I felt the weight of every unspoken connection pressing down, the emotional scars I carried like currency, the bruised past I pretended was armor, the faceless attraction of distance that had let me run without being recognized, the hidden pain I thought I could disguise in motion. All of it stood naked beneath her gaze. The flame flickered. Asher whimpered, and I thought, if she stays, something will change. If she leaves, we will collapse. Either way, the silence is over. She didn't leave. She stood there, watching, like she was waiting for us to fail. Her blanket fell over us. Like an oath I was afraid to take, her shawl carried cedar, smoke, and warmth, but it felt like a vow I couldn't trust yet. The moment Ivy Redfern unfolded it, the air in the ruined depot shifted. The storm beyond the walls clawed and screamed, but the blanket fell with a weight that silenced everything inside me. It smelled of cedar wood burned clean, of smoke that had clung to 1,000 nights of survival, of fabric that had soaked sweat, tears, maybe even blood, but still endured. It was not just cloth, it was history. And when she placed it across Asher's shoulders and mine, it felt less like protection and more like an oath, one I wasn't sure I wanted written in my name. Asher surrendered instantly. My little brother, whose bones had grown up too fast in hunger, leaned into it as if the shawl had been waiting for him all his life. His eyes fluttered shut, his lips parted, and I could see tears track down his face. They weren't the loud sobs of a child, they were the quiet kind, the kind born from a bruise so deep it no longer knows how to scream. His hands gripped the edge of the shawl as though letting go meant waking from a dream. But I resisted. My body stiffened under the fabric, every muscle tight, as if it were chains instead of comfort. Warmth should have been a gift, but to me it felt like a trick. Hunger is honest, cold is merciless, but warmth asks for belief. Warmth asks you to trust it will stay. And nothing in my bruised past taught me that warmth was anything but temporary. I remembered the cracked sidewalks where boys like me walked faceless, pretending we were immune to the ache of belonging. I remembered diner booths at 2 a.m., where silence was safer than the risk of eye contact. I remembered letters of truth I left unopened because forgiveness written in ink was more terrifying than silence. And I remembered mirrors in penthouse bathrooms that reflected me back like an accusation. A man too distant to belong anywhere, too abandoned to be healed. And now here was Ivy, draping a blanket across me as if she hadn't learned the same brutal truths. Her silence unsettled me more than her words ever could have. She didn't speak, didn't ask questions, didn't pry. She only tucked the fabric around us with the same motion a parent might use when checking on a child at night. She didn't demand our story. She offered her presence. And presence, I realized, was more dangerous than interrogation, because interrogation, I knew how to fight. But presence had the power to dismantle me. Asher exhaled into her shoulder like he had found home. His trust was immediate, instinctive, unguarded. Mine was barricaded, buried under years of self-preservation. Yet even as I fought it, my body betrayed me. My shoulders softened, my jaw unclenched, my ribs expanded with a breath that tasted less like desperation and more like recognition. Ivy didn't force it. She only let her silence stay beside mine. And in that silence, the blanket became heavier not with fabric, but with what it asked of me. To admit that I wanted what Asher had found in her embrace. I wanted to collapse into it. I wanted to surrender. But if I did, what would happen when she left? When warmth vanished the way fire does after it has burned out? The lantern flickered, reflecting faintly against the shawl, as though Gideon's flame approved of her gesture. For the first time, I wondered if the lantern wasn't meant to be guarded alone. For the first time, I wondered if Gideon's voice had brought her here deliberately. Ivy leaned closer. Her breath warmed the frozen air against my ear, and the whisper that followed weighed more than the fire, more than the cold, more than the years of silence combined. When she leaned close, her whisper felt heavier than the fire had ever been. "Stay forever," the Choctaw widow whispered, and the night held its breath. Her whisper was softer than snow, but it bound us like iron. No child guards alone. I had been running from forever all my life. Forever was a dirty word, a chain dressed up like a promise. In foster hallways, forever meant another broken placement. In city diners, forever was the ritual of missed connections, strangers too afraid to look each other in the eye. On cracked sidewalks under neon street lights, forever was just the sound of my own shoes reminding me I was temporary. In penthouse mirrors, forever was the echo of a man who had nothing left but distance. Even the clinic where second chances were waiting had offered me forever, and I turned away, because signing my name on a line felt like surrendering to hope, and hope had always cost more than hunger. Forever had meant punishment. But now, when Ivy Redfern whispered, "Stay forever," it sounded like mercy. Her eyes didn't move when she said it. They stayed steady, dark, unreadable, as if carved from patience itself. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't threatening. She was stating something that already existed, as if my name had been stitched into her vow before she ever found us. The storm hushed outside. Even the wind seemed to understand that her words were heavier than weather. Asher, still wrapped in her shawl, stirred. He murmured in his sleep, and the word that escaped his lips tore through me. Mama. He had given her the title without hesitation, without doubt. He had accepted her promise, as if Gideon himself had sent her. But I could not. Inside me, a storm louder than the blizzard raged. Vulnerability screamed that I wanted this. Mistrust whispered that I would lose it. Yearning burned like a wound I hadn't allowed to heal. My ribs tightened with the ache of choosing between two lives, the one where I trusted and the one where I survived. The lantern sat heavy in my lap, flame trembling but alive. For months, it had been the only thing between us and oblivion. But now, Ivy's promise rivaled it. The lantern was Gideon's voice. Ivy was something stranger. A voice I didn't know if I deserved, but one I wanted to believe. Stay forever. The word echoed in me like a sentence I wasn't sure I could serve. To stay meant admitting I was tired of running. To stay meant admitting I wanted healing, intimacy, a second chance at recognition. To stay meant trusting that love didn't have to fit fairy tale tropes, that love could be quiet, ordinary, resilient. Ivy reached out, her hand brushing mine where the lantern's handle dug into my palm. Her touch was soft, unhurried, deliberate. She didn't demand I let go of the lantern. She only touched the hand that held it, as if to say, I will not take it from you, but I will carry its weight beside you. The silence between us stretched, not absence, presence, the kind of silence that feels like a room being built, brick by brick, out of patience. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to cry. I wanted to collapse into the cedar-scented promise of her shawl. But I only sat there trembling, my heart caught between disbelief and desire. Because I knew that if I said yes, if I truly stayed, I would no longer be faceless. I would be recognized. And recognition is more terrifying than loneliness. Ivy didn't move. She didn't push. She only let the storm pause around us, as though waiting for my answer. Forever the word echoed inside me like a sentence I wasn't sure I could serve. Belonging cut deeper than hunger, but I didn't run. Hunger is sharp, but belonging cuts deeper, and I didn't know which wound I feared more. I thought hunger would be the hardest thing I'd ever face. The nights when my stomach twisted until it felt like knives inside me. The mornings when Asher's lips were cracked from thirst and I had nothing to give him. Hunger was a merciless teacher, but it was honest. It told you exactly what it wanted: food, water, warmth. Belonging was worse. Belonging was crueler. Belonging looked like safety, but it asked you to risk everything inside your chest. Hunger might kill the body, but belonging threatened to kill the distance I had spent my whole life building. Ivy Redfern moved through the ruins with a steadiness that unsettled me. She didn't rush. She didn't try to replace Gideon or force herself into the space where grief lived. She simply existed beside us, teaching survival in small ways: how to bank a fire so it lived longer than the night, how to carve thin strips of bark to chew when your throat closed with hunger, how to wrap your feet in rags so frost didn't climb too fast. They were simple lessons, ordinary tasks, but the way she offered them carried a patience I didn't know how to hold. She never said, "Trust me." She simply gave us ways to stay alive and let trust choose for itself whether to grow. Asher bonded to her instantly. He followed her movements the way a child follows sunlight across a room. His laughter, the sound I thought I'd never hear again, returned in small bursts, like sparks from wood too damp to burn but still stubborn enough to try. He clung to her stories. Her songs hummed under breath. Her silence that somehow made him feel less alone. And I feared it. Every time Asher leaned against her shawl, every time his hand found hers instead of mine, I felt my ribs ache with something sharp and ugly. Not jealousy, fear. Fear that he was building a home in someone who might leave, someone the storm might take, someone who, like everyone before, might vanish when we needed them most. I had seen too many letters of truth unopened because I couldn't bear the risk that they contained forgiveness I wasn't brave enough to accept. At night, when the lantern flickered between us, I stared into its flame and swore I heard Gideon's voice telling me that bonds are both our greatest strength and our sharpest knife. I wanted to tell Ivy no. I wanted to tell Asher not to trust. But the words caught in my throat like shards of glass, because the truth was simpler and far more terrifying. I wanted to belong too, but belonging meant recognition. Recognition meant intimacy. Intimacy meant opening wounds I had sealed with silence, and silence had been my only weapon against loneliness. That night, as Asher slept with his head on Ivy's lap and the blanket draped across us all, the lantern glowed warmer than usual. Its light stretched further, touched corners of the ruined depot it had never reached before, and in its flicker, I swore it spoke a new name, not Gideon's, not mine, not Asher's, hers. That night, as the lantern glowed, I swore it spoke a new name, hers. We walked away from ruins, with the lantern between us. Leaving the depot was like burying him twice, but walking meant survival. The ashes still smoked when we left. The charred wood of the depot sagged like the bones of a giant who had died standing. Every step away felt like betrayal, like abandoning Gideon a second time. I wanted to stay, to clutch the lantern and sit in the ruins until my grief turned me to ash beside him. But Ivy knew better. She said nothing, only lifted Asher onto her hip and started walking across the white plains. Survival, I realized, is often less about bravery and more about moving your feet when your heart wants to freeze. The land was merciless. Snow swept across the horizon like endless white dunes, hiding every path, erasing every footprint before it could be followed. The sky was an iron lid pressing us down. Wolves cried in the distance, their howls blending with the wind until it was impossible to tell whether it was storm or predator waiting for us. The cold gnawed at my bare feet until they bled, but I kept the lantern close to my chest, as if its fragile light could keep both the wolves and my own despair at bay. Ivy walked ahead, steady, unbending, her braids snapping against the wind like banners of survival. Asher clung to her, his face buried in her shawl, trusting her shadow the way I once trusted Gideon's voice. I trailed behind, carrying grief like an extra weight, and the lantern like a second heartbeat. The further we walked, the more the world around us seemed to collapse into silence. It wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of watching, as though the snow itself held its breath, waiting to see if we would make it or join the ash. I wanted to believe the lantern was guiding us, but the longer I listened, the more it sounded like warning. Its flame hissed, its glass rattled with every gust, and sometimes, when I stared too long, I swore I saw faces flickering inside it. Gideon's, yes, but others too. Strangers, ghosts, people I could not name but felt I had already lost. Every mile carried a question. Were we walking toward life, or away from it? Was the lantern leading us into belonging, or luring us into a new kind of abandonment? By dusk, the cold deepened into cruelty. The horizon bled orange, then collapsed into black. The wolves howled closer, their shadows circling just outside the ring of lantern light. Ivy did not falter. She set Asher down, placed her hand on the lantern's glass, and whispered something in Choctaw I could not understand. The flame steadied, grew taller, brighter, as if it had been waiting for her touch. I held it tighter. My chest burned with a thought I couldn't push away. Maybe the lantern was no longer ours alone. Maybe it had chosen her too. And as the wind howled and the snow deepened, I realized with a shiver that the further we walked, The louder the lantern seemed to whisper. The further we walked, the louder the lantern seemed to whisper, and I couldn't tell if it was guiding or warning. When the flame faltered, Ivy Redfern taught it how to live in us. The night the lantern nearly died, she taught us the truth. The flame wasn't in glass, it was in us. The storm that night was different. It wasn't just cold. It was a predator. The wind clawed through gaps in the ruined walls, snarling like a beast that had been tracking us for days. Snow found its way into every crack, coating our blankets, biting at our skin, until even our teeth felt frozen. I held the lantern tight against my chest, but the flame inside trembled, shrinking with every gust, shrinking like it had lost its will to live. Asher saw it first. His eyes widened, and he grabbed my arm. "Silas, it's going out." His voice cracked, raw with terror. The boy who had survived fire, hunger, and loneliness now trembled at the sight of that fragile light thinning to nothing. His small hands shook so badly he nearly knocked the glass. I wanted to tell him it would be fine. I wanted to promise him the flame would never die, but I couldn't, because I was panicking too. My chest constricted, my hands sweated even in the cold. If the lantern died, then Gideon's voice would vanish, and with it, the last piece of him I had left. It wasn't just fire, it was memory, and losing it meant losing him all over again. Asher began to cry, muffled sobs that turned into sharp gasps. I tried to shield the glass with my body, as though flesh could block a storm, but the wind was relentless, rattling the frame, making the flame gutter lower and lower. And in that moment, for the first time since the fire at the depot, I felt the old fear rise up inside me, the fear that no matter what I did, I would fail, that I could not protect my brother, that I could not even keep my father's memory alive. Ivy didn't panic. She crouched beside us, her shawl drawn tight, her face calm in the chaos. She reached out, steady hands on both our shoulders, and spoke softly, as if the storm had no right to silence her. "The flame is not the glass. The flame is not the wick. The flame is not even the fire you see. The flame is memory, and memory does not die when the wind blows." Her words cut through me sharper than the cold. I shook my head, refusing to believe. It's all we have left of him. If it dies, he dies again. She leaned closer, her eyes steady on mine. "Number, the lantern is not him. You are him. Both of you. Every breath you take, every step you refuse to surrender, that is Gideon's flame. The lantern only reminded you, but the fire has always been in you." Asher sniffled, looking up at her, tears streaking his cheeks. His small voice trembled. "But what if we forget?" Ivy touched his face with a hand so gentle it seemed carved from patience itself. "Then you light it again. Memory doesn't vanish when a wick goes dark. Memory waits. And love waits longer than even memory." The storm howled harder, the lantern guttering until the flame was no bigger than a pinprick of gold. My heart pounded, begging it to hold on. But instead of collapsing in fear, I did something different. I breathed with it. I matched its tremble. I let my chest rise and fall in rhythm with the tiny flicker, as though we were keeping each other alive. And in that strange communion, I realized what Ivy meant. The lantern had always been fragile, but we weren't. We were still here, bleeding, freezing, terrified but alive. And as long as we lived, so did he. Ivy added a strip of cedar bark to the embers, whispering something low and steady. The flame sputtered, then steadied, then rose. Not bright, not strong, but enough. Asher gasped in relief, throwing his arms around her. I sagged back, my whole body trembling, not from cold, but from the sudden weight of understanding. The lantern was not a curse. It was not a judge. It was not a burden to be carried forever. It was a teacher, and tonight it had taught us that we could keep fire alive without glass. But as the flame rose taller, the glass glowed brighter, and in that sudden flare of light, something shifted in the shadows of the ruin. The storm fell silent, the snow stilled, and the walls shuddered as though something unseen had moved. But when the lantern roared back to life, it lit more than snow. It lit something I wasn't ready to see. I set the lantern in her lodge and chose the word home. When I laid the lantern down, I wasn't guarding anymore, I was choosing. The journey to Ivy's lodge was the longest walk of my life, not because the miles were endless, but because every step toward her home felt like a step away from Gideon's ghost. The snow deepened, the wolves cried, the cold scraped at my bones, but none of it was as heavy as the decision I carried in my chest. When we reached it, the lodge looked ordinary, a simple shape against the storm, its roof sagging under snow, smoke curling from the chimney like a sigh. But to me, it looked like a test, a doorway that demanded I choose between two lives, the life where I carried grief like a shield, or the life where I dared to set it down. Inside, it was warm. Cedar smoke hung thick in the air. Furs covered the floor, patched and worn, but soft. The fire in the hearth snapped and hissed like it had been waiting for us. Asher rushed forward, laughing as he touched the furs, his face alight with wonder. I stood frozen at the threshold, the lantern still clutched to my chest. Ivy turned to me, her voice calm, unhurried. "You can stay, or you can leave. No chains here, no demands. But if you stay, you must choose it. Not for the fire, not for me, for you." Her words cut deeper than the cold ever could. For the first time in my life, I realized belonging could not be borrowed. It had to be chosen, and choice was something I had spent years running from. Asher tugged at my sleeve. His eyes shone with tears and hope. "He would want us warm, Silas. He wouldn't want us guarding ashes forever." I looked down at the lantern. Its flame danced steady, but the glass was scratched, cracked, worn from storms and sorrow. My father's voice had lived in it. My fear had lived in it. My guilt had lived in it. But now, it was only a vessel. The fire inside was ours to claim or release. Slowly, I walked to the hearth. Every step was heavy, like walking through years of abandonment, loneliness, silence. I knelt before the fire, set the lantern down beside it, and for the first time in months, I loosened my grip. I wasn't guarding anymore. I wasn't carrying grief like a curse. I was choosing warmth, choosing trust, choosing a place where silence meant presence, not punishment. The fire flared, as if approving, and in that moment, I whispered the word I had been afraid to speak my entire life: home. But just as the word left my lips, the lantern groaned. A thin crack raced across the glass, sharp and sudden, splitting it open with a sound like bone breaking. Cliffhanger. As I did, the lantern's glass cracked like the sound of fate breaking open. Our father's light didn't end, it multiplied. We thought the lantern was only his until it became ours. For months, maybe years if you measure time by grief instead of calendars, I had carried that flame like a prison sentence. The ember horn was gone, Gideon was gone, but the lantern remained a fragile, flickering reminder that survival doesn't mean you're alive. When I held it, I thought I was protecting him, as if keeping that fire burning would drag him back from the ash. I guarded it like a shrine. I clutched it like a wound. I prayed to it as if light itself could raise the dead. But that night, in Ivy Redfern's lodge, everything changed. The lodge didn't roar with survival. It breathed it. The fire in the hearth didn't panic like ours had in the ruins of the depot. It burned steady, patient, alive with the confidence of something that had outlasted too many storms to count. Cedar smoke curled into the rafters, firs softened the walls, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was trespassing in warmth. I felt invited. I set the lantern down beside that hearth, my fingers uncurled, trembling, not with fear but with release. The glass was cracked, the metal dented, but the light inside glowed steady, as if the flame had been waiting for this moment to rest beside another fire, to stop being a shrine and start being a seed. Asher collapsed into the blankets, his breath soft, his chest rising and falling in the rhythm of safety. He hadn't slept like that since before the depot burned. For so long his dreams had been broken, shattered by hunger, by fear, by the sound of wolves outside and my own desperate whispers trying to promise him safety I couldn't deliver. But here, wrapped in Ivy's shawl, he slept like a child who believed he would wake tomorrow. That was the first miracle Ivy gave us. Not food, not shelter, not even fire. Safety. Ivy sat across the fire, her shawl draped over her shoulders, her hands wrapped around a wooden cup. She didn't ask questions. She didn't press me to speak. She didn't even glance at the lantern. She just sat, still and present, as if her silence itself was an oath. I will not abandon you. For years, silence had been my punishment. In foster care, silence meant no one was coming back. In the city, silence meant a lover had left without saying goodbye. In the clinics, silence was the pause before they called someone else's name, never mine. I had taught myself to fear quiet, to mistake it for emptiness. But now, in that lodge, silence felt different. It didn't accuse. It didn't punish. It held. Ivy's silence wasn't absence. It was recognition. The lantern glowed beside us, its fractured glass scattering constellations across the firs. I stared at those cracks and remembered every mirror I had ever hated. Diner bathrooms that gave me back a face I couldn't forgive. Penthouse windows that reflected me as a hollow man who had mistaken wealth for worth. Cracked sidewalks in cities that held my shadow longer than anyone ever held me. Broken glass had always accused me. But this broken glass? It was beautiful. It glowed through its fractures. It told me, maybe you too can shine through what broke you. Ivy finally spoke, her voice low, carrying the patience of storms survived. You carried it far, but carrying is not the same as belonging. Do you know the difference? My throat tightened. Belonging asks you to stay. She nodded, slow, and staying asks you to trust. Those words cut deeper than hunger ever had. I thought of all the times I ran. From Gideon's fire, from Asher's questions, from letters I never opened because truth written in ink is harder than silence. Running had been my religion. Distance, my God. And here she was, asking me to commit heresy, to stay. Asher stirred in his sleep and whispered something soft, the words I couldn't catch, but that sounded like prayer. My chest ached. I couldn't keep dragging him from ruin to ruin, storm to storm. I realized then that we hadn't been guarding a lantern at all. We had been waiting for someone who would guard us. And Ivy, in her patience, her silence, her presence, had done exactly that. The storm outside growled one last time, then faded into a tired sigh. The lodge creaked, but it didn't shudder. Wolves howled in the distance, but they didn't come near. The world seemed to bow its head, conceding that here, in this room, the living had carved out a sanctuary. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. They weren't sharp this time. not the kind that punish and scald. They were warm, like a river thawing after winter. They slid down my face without shame. Grief wasn't leaving me. It was transforming, making space for something else. Ivy's eyes caught mine across the fire. She didn't flinch at what she saw. She didn't pity me. She didn't look away. She only nodded once, a gesture so small it could have been missed. But inside it lived recognition. Not the kind that demands words, the kind that says, "I see you. You don't need to hide anymore." The lantern flickered, its cracked glass glowing brighter. Every fracture seemed to sparkle, as if brokenness itself was worthy of light. I reached out, touched it gently, not as a guard clutching his weapon, but as a man touching something alive. For the first time, my grip loosened without fear. I could share. I could let go. I thought of Gideon, not of his death, not of fire consuming the depot, not of the ash that tried to erase us. I thought of his hands, steady as he lit the lantern for us the first time. I thought of his voice, low and certain. Fire is not just fire. Fire is memory. Fire is survival. Fire is family made visible. And in that moment, I understood. Gideon's light had not ended with him. It had multiplied. It had lived in me, in Asher. And now, impossibly, it lived in Ivy too. I leaned back against the firs, the warmth soaking into my bones, and whispered words that scared me more than hunger ever had. "I want to stay." Ivy didn't smile. She didn't exclaim. She only nodded again, the same steady nod she always gave, because real vows are not fireworks. They are silence lived faithfully, day after day. The storm surrendered, the roof stilled, the world quieted, and in that silence, I learned what home really was. It wasn't luxury cars carrying me between borrowed lives. It wasn't penthouse windows reflecting a hollow man. It wasn't diner booths where missed connections rehearsed their ballet of loneliness. It wasn't unopened letters that I was too cowardly to read. Home was here, in cedar smoke, in Asher's soft breathing, in Ivy's quiet presence, in a lantern whose cracks glowed like stars. I exhaled, long and heavy, and felt the old weight leave me, the need to guard, the fear of loss, the refusal to trust. What replaced it was quiet, not empty quiet, full quiet, quiet that held, quiet that belonged. The fire hummed, the lantern flickered, and for the first time in my life, forever didn't sound like punishment. It sounded like home.